Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's former president Yoon Suk Yeol has been sentenced to life in prison for leading an insurrection. The Seoul court ruled that his decision to send troops to the National Assembly under emergency martial law was not a political judgment call, but a criminal act aimed at paralyzing a constitutional institution. Prosecutors last week had sought the death penalty, but the court instead imposed life imprisonment, acknowledging both the gravity of the offense and limited mitigating factors. For a sitting president to declare martial law and then be held criminally responsible for it marks a defining moment in South Korea's constitutional history. Tonight, we examine what this verdict means for presidential power, emergency authority, and the future of democratic accountability. For this, we connect to Song Se-ryun, professor of law at Kyunghee University. Big welcome, professor.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Baek Eun-seok, professor of law at Handong International Law School. Good to see you, professor.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start our discussion first with Professor Song. Like I said, the court has now sentenced former President Yoon to life imprisonment for insurrection. Tell us, how historic is this ruling in South Korea's constitutional history?
Well, as you mentioned, this is the first time that a democratically elected Korean president has been convicted as a leader, as he was sitting president. I mean, we had military generals turn the politicians convicted before for the very crime of coup d'etat, but this mature democracy that we have, having a sitting president being committed and impeached, and he is facing a life sentence in prison, it's a historic moment, and it says a lot about Korean democracy, even with the unfortunate happenings that happened in the martial law declaration. I think it will set a very a stern precedent, and in that sense, even if this was a pretty unfortunate event, I think it sets a pretty historic precedent and some milestone for the Korean democracy and judicial principles.
Definitely. So that alone, it signals a constitutional watershed moment. And building on that, the judicial panel explicitly ruled that the December 3rd emergency martial law amounted to insurrection, recognizing both intent to disrupt the constitutional order and the element of violent uprising. Professor Baek, how significant is this legal clarification for future cases involving emergency powers?
Well, I think the significance is very high, obviously, and echoing what Professor Song said earlier, this is the first time in Korea's history, and I really do hope that this would be the last time that a former president is found guilty of the crime of insurrection for what he did while he was in office as a sitting president. So that alone brings tremendous gravity and significance to what happened in this case. And the message from the court today is very clear. Former President Yoon has been asserting all throughout his impeachment trial as well as a criminal trial that the power to declare martial law belongs to the president. And as presidential power, an emergency power, it is not subject to judicial review. Now, the court sent out a very clear message that's not the case. Even though the Constitution does grant that power to the president, his exercise of that power is subject to constitutional and legal requirements. And if his exercise of the power is not in compliance with those requirements, then he's subject to criminal conviction. So I think that's a very clear message about rule of law, and that's a very important message for constitutional democracy.
Definitely. So it's really about how far emergency powers can legally go, and we hope for no another. Not we won't hope for another case like this to happen in the future. But staying with the court's reasoning, the judges they said it was difficult to deny that former President Yoon internally held the intent to paralyze the National Assembly and acknowledge that troops were sent, constituting an act of uprising. Professor Song, what findings were really decisive in recognizing him as the ringleader?
Well, the criminal conviction of the insurrection has basically three elements. You have a usurpation of constitutional order and the intent to incite violence. I think in each one of them, the judge was examining whether there were enough evidence to implicate the President Yoon to those elements. I think they found that there's enough paper trail, and the former president's own actions pretty clearly spoke that he was the one who was directing it, who had the intent to do it, and there were conversations and kind of paper trails that show that he's the one to do it. Now, I think the deployment of the troops is the key, and the judge has mentioned it several times, and that's the kind of a red flag and red line that the president crossed over. And it's pretty clear that the former President Yoon was the one who wanted the troops to be deployed, and he put the direct order. So in those evidences, regardless of they saying it was short, there was no bloodshed or violence, I think those elements, one by one, were pretty clearly satisfied in the minds of the judges.
Right, so it seems as though the court clearly focused on intention and command responsibility as well. When it comes to sentencing, prosecutors had sought the death penalty a few days ago, but the court imposed life imprisonment instead today. And the judges cited factors like lack of meticulous planning, limited physical force, and the absence of live ammunition use. Professor Peck, how should we interpret the court's reasoning in stopping short of capital punishment?
Right. Conviction itself and finding him guilty of the crime of insurrection, I think that's not subject to much of controversy. Now, the sentence is more controversial because as the prosecution sought the death penalty, and now the court found him only guilty for a life imprisonment. Now, yes, there were some factors that the court mentioned, as you referred to, such as a lack of meticulous planning, limited scope of physical force, and maybe the absence of widespread bloodshed. Now, it's hard to see whether these factors could be mitigating factors. Now, we don't have many, and I think fortunately we don't have many references for comparison purposes. 44 years ago, when former President Chun was found guilty for the crime of insurrection, the prosecution sought the death penalty. And this time, the prosecution, comparing this case with that 44 years ago, among other things, over the past, more than 4 decades, Korea has matured democracy. And unlike back then, when the person charged with insurrection was not yet a president, he's a military commander. By comparison, this time, the one who is charged with the crime of insurrection was an elected public office holder, the president. So comparing these two cases, the prosecution sought at least similar sentence for the former President Yoon, and that's death penalty. And so I don't know whether these factors that the court mentioned could really be taken as mitigating factors for the sentence rather than the death penalty, but instead life imprisonment.
Mm-hmm. So within that kind of a reasoning, the ruling, it emphasized that the core of the case was sending the military to the National Assembly. Professor Song, legally speaking, why is that act really so central in determining insurrection?
Well, going back to the elements that we were talking about, sending the troops to the legislature, that is a pretty emphatic evidence that he intended to usurp the constitutional order. And my God, this is, if it's a political judgment is concerned, that's a very bonehead play among the histories of Korea. Legislature is close to a sacred institution. I mean, in 1987, we abolished the presidential power to dissolve and disband the legislature. And the legislature sits as the kind of a very important, as it should be, the institution, and sending the troops to the legislature, blocking the access to it. I think it is a clear indication that that element is satisfied, but at the same time, I think it is a pretty good violation of not safeguarding the constitutional principles. I think it also speaks to the intention to incite violence. That's another the legally the required elements. The judge found also that there was no bloodshed and there was no the violent that we can compare to either Romuhyun, I mean the Notaewu Chonduan times, but it doesn't matter in this mature the democracy. I think sending the troops to the legislature and having them stationed there with the force, I think that's enough legally, and I think that's a kind of signal to the future presidents what to do and, more importantly, what not to do when it involves in the legislature and the use of force.
Right, definitely. Deploying troops to the parliament, it indeed was a very symbolic move then. Now, when it expand the lens to other defendants, several former officials received lengthy prison terms, including 30 years for former Defense Minister Kim Mok-yeon. Professor Baek, does today's verdict show a consistent hierarchy of responsibility across the defendants? What are your thoughts?
Well, President Yoon and the 7 other defendants, with the exception of 2 of them having been found not guilty, received a sentence ranging from, for President Yoon, life imprisonment, former Minister Kim, 30 years, and the rest of the defendants somewhere between 3 to 18 years. Now, within this group of defendants, in this case, I would say, yes, there was maybe as you put it, a hierarchy of responsibility and corresponding level of sentences. And so that's that. But I think the more difficult and probably more interesting comparison is, how about former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, who received 23 years imprisonment, and former Minister Lee Sang-min, who received 7 years. Now, comparing those 2 with these sentences that today's defendants received, that would be harder and be more interesting, I suppose, whether there is indeed a consistent hierarchy of responsibility involving essentially the same act.
So now with the verdict released today, when we look ahead, Professor Peck, what do you think are the strongest legal grounds the defense is likely to raise when they appeal?
Well, usually when appeal is made, either or both, challenging the court's use of evidence and the court's use of doctrines and principles of law. Now, in terms of the latter, legal doctrines and principles involving the elements of the crime of insurrection, as far as I can tell, I don't know whether the defense could have much more left to argue against, because the court's ruling today relied on the Korean Supreme Court's earlier decisions. And as far as I can tell, the legal doctrines and principles involved are rather clear. Although I suppose the defense would raise an argument based on legal doctrines and principles. More likely, though, the appeal would be primarily about the court's use of evidence. And I think during the interview immediately following the court's ruling today, the lead lawyer for President Yoon basically indicated something of a similar nature, that they would challenge the court's use of evidence. So probably that would be the primary ground that the defense may use once appeal is made. That's my sense.
Right. So the court's use of evidence will have to watch on how that will be used in their appeal. Now, finally, when we step back a little bit from the courtroom, so we have a former president now sentenced to life imprisonment for insurrection. Professor Song, what precedent does this actually set for the constitutional limits of presidential authority in South Korea going forward?
Well, first off, there's a bright line rule. Everybody agrees that the use of force, use of troops as against the legislature, for one, is a no-no. I mean, that's the fastest way to get dethroned and get convicted and face a life sentence, or it could have been a death sentence today. So I think that's a pretty a good precedent, or a very strong precedent. But you gotta see the trend as well. I think that the former president Park Geun-hye, when she was facing the constitutional trial, I think the trend is that the Korean judiciary and also the society expects a very higher a standard for the president to uphold the Constitution and the constitutional principles. I mean, essentially, the former the President Yoon's argument was that, well, my intention was noble, maybe not the evil, that I wanted to awaken people of the kind of awful politics that the other parties having. Well, first of all, that the political judgment is very suspect, but also, at the same time, the court has soundly rejected that argument. I think I like the quote that the judge used: "You cannot steal a candle just because you are reading a Bible." I think that there is a kind of very strong precedent, and also what kind of the guardian that the president has to be in Korea. So I mentioned the trend, but there are several steps that the Korean history has taken to establish a presidency as somewhat of a guardian of the Constitution and constitutional principles. In that sense, I think it's a kind of some historical moment, but at the same time, something that will be put into a constitutional textbook.
Definitely. So this case, it really would reshape how presidential power would be used moving forward in the country. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Song.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And of course, Professor Peck, we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.